you're starting a business, you want somebody to buy your product, right? And historically, cigarettes, they didn't taste good. They don't taste good. They taste bad. So until you can get someone over that hurdle of trying the product that you're trying to sell that tastes bad, and that nicotine in the product getting to your brain and tricking you and saying, oh, this is good. Let me have more. As opposed to now, they have figured it out with their marketing strategies that made it taste good. So now people want to try it, right? Or you're more susceptible to try it because it tastes good, but it still has the nicotine in it. It's going to rewire your brain. And that's one of the conversations that we want to have with you guys is the effects of the chemicals, substances, and even the unknowns with vaping. We know that it has nicotine in it. So nicotine is a chemical. It's in tobacco cigarettes, and now it's in vaping substance. And we have these little receptors, nicotinic receptors, all throughout our body, everywhere, in our brain, in our skeletal muscle, in our nervous systems. But what the nicotine does is it tells our brain, kind of gives it a reward. It makes us happy. And it tells us we want more. And it tells us it's pleasurable. And it starts making us feel good enough that it starts releasing these other endorphins and neurotransmitters inside of our brain that make us feel good. But during that same time, it's having harmful effects on our body.
Because I'm sure you guys have all seen the homemade videos for vape where you can make your own vape cartridge, make your own vape liquid. And these cartridges are supposed to be regulated, but they're not all regulated to a large degree. So who knows what type of substances are actually inside of them as far as bacteria? What do they have on their hands at the time? What's growing? What kind of medium is that allowing, or what kind of bacteria is that medium growing? Because it's just not regulated. One of the things that we were talking about is that there are certain things that we found in vape cartridges that we know exist and that have been found in what we call BALs, which are bronchial lavages. It's where they go down in your lungs, they squirt a little bit of water, they suck it back out, and they're able to test what's actually in that wash. And one of the things they found consistently in folks who vape is something called vitamin E acetate, okay? Which vitamin E is a fat-soluble vitamin. Everybody needs it, all right? But the difference is it's not supposed to be in your lungs. But on your skin, it's good for skin tightening, skin renewal. It's great for other healthy effects for the body. But it's not so good when it's vaped and it's found in the lung washings. Because those people who they found that in, they were having some pretty serious lung issues at the time, vaping-related lung injuries. And so that's one of the things that we know exist. But there are many other things that are probably in these cartridges that we don't know exist. Another thing we know is in there is coconut oil. Coconut oil. Everyone's heard of coconut oil. Put it on your skin. You can eat it. You can ingest it. But again, not something that's meant to be found in your lungs. And so when we're finding these substances that we know are good for you, and I think that's part of the thing is that they're marketing, oh, it's coconut oil. There's so many uses for coconut oil. That was like one of the hot things a couple of years ago is, the 100 different uses of coconut oil, but not actually meant to be in the lungs. And I think these companies are, using this as if it's good for everywhere else, why wouldn't it be good to vape as well?
You have to think of your lungs like a sponge. And if you inhale something that's sticky and moisturized, and it's heated, it's more likely to harbor there in those tissues. And something that harbors in a warm environment that's not sterile can grow bacteria, right? And that bacteria can turn into abscesses, pneumonia, bad things over time. And one of the tactics that you hear commonly is that vaping is not harmful, or vaping is less harmful. Well, we do not know, to be honest. We know some of the chemicals are carcinogenic chemicals that they're using. We know that nicotine's in there and the effects that it has. But we do not really know how bad vaping really is because it's not been around long enough for us to really study it through generations. But by the trajectory of what we've seen with the chemicals and folks' exposure to these chemicals via other means, the outlook doesn't look good. Anybody ever heard of COPD or emphysema? It's obstructive lung disease, right? So what do we breathe in right now? What are we breathing in? Oxygen. And then we breathe out what? Great. So COPD, from exposure to these harmful chemicals and traditional smoking, we know that over time, it impairs that gas exchange between oxygen and carbon dioxide. Yes, you still can breathe in oxygen, although to a lesser degree than somebody who's healthy. But the biggest issue is getting the carbon dioxide out. Exhaling, right? Because that oxygen is supposed to come in, it jumps on these little alveolar membranes inside of our lungs, and it gets transitioned into the bloodstream. And it gets circulated, and at the same time, oxygen that's already been consumed and comes back as carbon dioxide through gas exchange, jumps onto these alveolar membranes, and then they transfer and we breathe them out, right? So we brought a ventilator here to try to demonstrate this. And this should represent a lung, right? One of your lungs. I'm going to start, give it just a second here to warm up. So right now, you see whenever the lung expands, that's like it's taking a breath in. And then whenever it collapses, it's like it's exhaling, breathing out. You see a healthy lung blows up and then collapses because all the air goes out. We only keep a little bit of residual air in our lungs, but we breathe most of that air out because we got to get rid of that carbon dioxide, right? Well, what happens in a diseased lung can be best demonstrated by this. You're breathing some oxygen in, but look, when you exhale, is that lung collapsing like it was before? No. You're only getting a fraction of what a normal lung gets out. And so you start building up these bad gases over time.
What do you think that does to your brain when you build up those bad gases?
It shuts down.
Essentially. So your brain is triggered to breathe when you build up the CO2. But after a while, your brain gets used to being in this high environment of CO2 and it gets rewired and says, okay, well, now I'm used to living with higher levels of CO2. I don't have to breathe as much. And so as a result, these toxins start to build up in your body. When you start to build up higher levels of CO2, you can become altered. You can get to the point to where you're essentially obtunded. You're not even really responding. And it becomes very dangerous.
We call it CO2 narcosis.
Exactly. And so at you guys' age, it's hard to see the effects of, what vaping, with your friends socially does or, for a few years does. But we see the downstreaming of things for people who have been smoking or vaping for long periods of time and what that has done. And ultimately, it ends up with what we call a revolving door into the emergency department or into your physician's office because, without your body's ability to exchange these harmful gases and to get rid of them and to the body to filter out through your lungs the way that it should, you start to retain all these harmful chemicals, all these harmful gases, all these harmful toxins, and then you become chronically sick.
And it starts like in your 30s as you getting bronchitis a couple of times a year. And then in your 40s and 50s, you start getting pneumonia. And then you start having to go to the emergency department and get admitted to the hospital for a few days to help your gas exchange. We try to help the inflammation and the infection in your lungs, and we may have to put you on the oxygen for a few days in the hospital. We may have to even put you on a ventilator for a few days in ICU. And that happens, a couple times a year until it continues to progress, and we're seeing you in the hospital every month, until a couple of times a month.
And we know you by name and face as soon as you walk in the door.
We can see your name pop up on the screen and know what you're there for. And it all starts with this exposure to nicotine that rewires your brain. Our brains develop until about age 25.
So you guys still have a ways to go.
And so it starts rewiring your brain and giving you this sense of pleasure from exposure to a drug that we think or a chemical that we think is benign. We haven't mentioned that nicotine impairs concentration. It impairs focus. As I said, that whenever we inhale nicotine, it gets distributed throughout our bloodstream and throughout all parts of our body. It affects our fine motor skills. So our precision starts to deteriorate over time. And it also, with the pleasure that it gives us, it makes us more susceptible to try other drugs. And we're starting to see that. Folks who vape, they're more apt to try things like marijuana or other stimulant drugs like methamphetamines, cocaine, the bad things.
And so we call that the gateway.
The gateway drug.
And no one thinks about nicotine being one of those gateway drugs. But again, I mean, with this whole vaping advertisement, and hooking people in, it's like, all right, well, I can vape nicotine. You can get THC cartridges and CBD cartridges just as easily. And so I think it has just become super accessible. Whereas once you'd have to kind of go make a shady deal to get, THC or anything like that, now it's really accessible. And, if I'm already snapping a nicotine vape cartridge in, what's the difference with throwing a THC or any other type of vape cartridge in? And so I think, you guys have heard the saying or the slogan, the more you know. I think being armed with this information, and knowing the downstream effect of knowing what it can do to your lungs, of knowing, that by starting with this, it might lead you down a path that I may not necessarily want to go. I think that's important for you guys to know the earlier the better.
I think it's critical just to understand just brief exposure to nicotine can cause an addiction.
Last lifetime.
It's a downhill spiral.
What questions do you guys have?
Does all the it affecting your brain, does that go along if you get secondhand smoke?
Good question. I think the rewiring of your brain is not the biggest aspect on the secondhand smoke. There are certainly significant side effects of secondhand smoke, such as asthma, such as other reactive airway diseases, if you will. But the rewiring part is more so kind of the direct inhalation and, the saturation of those receptors in the body.
I have a question about nicotine I just thought of. Does that also cause you to have more allergies? Is that connected by any chance?
So I think again, the nicotine in that instance, I don't think it's necessarily related to the allergies. I think it's the toxin of the smoke inhalation, that reacting, you're causing your lungs to react, and that being more the issue. Same kind of a similar process in why the secondhand smoke is an issue.
Okay.
It's more of a reactive airway disease.
So you hear some people say they're addicted to the sucking of hitting the vape. Do you think that's true? Of course, they can also be addicted to nicotine. But if they put it down, it's fine, but they still have the want to.
That's a very good question.
It is.
I think it's just like any other habit. You see people who form habits biting their nails. And so I think that could become habitual.
And that's the thing. I think there's very little oversight in knowing what's in any of these cartridges. And so I think that's kind of a do it at your own risk, as long as you're an adult, have at it. And I think that should be the telltale sign now. Because if it's melatonin, give that to kids, but no one's going to go and give their kid nicotine. So I think that should be kind of a sign right there in itself.
Yes.
Have you ever had to do anyone having to shrink?
No, I have personally not.
How would you get them under control since?
That's a good question. I mean, there are Shrink is probably kind of the new hot trend right now.
Mhm.
That's all over the news and what we hear about. So it's essentially a tranquilizer, veterinary tranquilizer, that's being used to either lace or cut fentanyl. And so some people are getting it and using it intentionally. Some people are being intoxicated by the substance because they thought they were using one thing and Trink was actually in it, which is kind of the more common thing. But anything strong enough to knock a horse out, is certainly strong enough to, exactly. So, like I was saying, that's one of the new hot things, but we've had medicines or drugs rather that have done the same things, in the past. And ultimately, we've got other drugs that we would give to try to kind of calm you down, to help kind of sedate you a little bit until the drug wears off.
There's a lot of these drugs are, like you said, they're cut, they're mixed. It's just not one isolated tranquilizer. They'll mix that with a stimulant. So it has kind of a twofold effect.
And what we call that is polysubstance use. I have another question about anxiety. I noticed one of the things they're marketing for these kids, because my daughter informed me about this, is they're informing them, or they're trying to sell them on that vapes lower anxiety, like it helps lower anxiety, which we know that's the opposite. Could you guys explain that a little bit, how that can have the actual opposite effect, or why that could have the opposite?
Yeah, well, nicotine is actually considered somewhat of a stimulant, has a stimulating effect. So
I hear people say I'm less hungry when I smoke.
it curbs your appetite, things like that. But I think that how that they try to market this as being a treatment for anxiety is because it's a habit. It's a distraction tool. Something that you can do or use in a moment when you're feeling anxious. But actually you're inducing a substance into your body that can actually exacerbate, worsen the anxiety that you're feeling.